Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Eniegolu. Now, 12 months ago this week, the EndSARS protests hit the streets of Nigerian cities with tens of thousands of demonstrators demanding an end to police transgressions. But even as they peacefully called for social justice and government reforms, their protests would later morph into something infinitely more destructive, becoming a vector for riots and the destruction of many businesses. So, as the country marks 1 year since those nationwide protests, what have been the financial implications and the economic impact of this damage to public and private property? Well, let's get an assessment now from the Vice President of Olam International and Chairman of the Nasima Export Trade Group, Ade Adefeko, who's also Honorary Consul for Botswana in Lagos. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What do you remember of those EndSARS protests and the impact they had on this country, broadly speaking?
Interesting question, Charles. I reflect over 1 year after and I say to myself, what did we learn? How did we get to this sorry past in the first place? Why the wanton destruction of property? The youth came out to make a point. The point was made, but at a point in time, you cannot ad infinitum protest. You need to come to the table and have a dialogue. But at a point in time, they seem to have been having a monologue with themselves. Unfortunately, it is often said that when things like this happen, the business community suffers because during that period, a lot of us were shut down at home, coupled with the pandemic, COVID, and a plethora of other issues. But I must say, and I must say this fairly, that at the onset, when they came up with their, agitation and their, I think it was a 7-point agenda they had, if I'm not mistaken, which a lot of people believe they should have probably concise into 2 or 3 points. Government more or less said, you know what, police brutality was the euphemism for what some might call bad governance, And the government said, you know what, we'll accede to that. We'll disband the SARS. That was concession number 1. Concession number 2, government says, you know what, we'll set up a judicial commission of inquiry to look into this extrajudicial murders and all and all. Concession number 2. But at a point in time, the EndSARS movement thought or decided to be a government on their own. So unfortunately, they got it wrong there. But I think they made a very, very strong point you know what, the youth can take charge. And they deployed technology, they deployed all resources available.
Well, in fairness to them,
they did.
Because I mean the protests started peacefully,
yes.
And for the most part they were peaceful.
Yes.
Their allegation is that they were infiltrated by people, by thugs and all kinds of criminals who then unleashed the riots, turned it from a peaceful protest into a riot, and that's when things started to fall apart.
I think I tend to agree with them to an extent, but again, they had no visible leadership. There was no one to talk to. I recall a few, if it's the Minister of Sports, who came on and said, you know what, we are ready to speak to them, but who are we going to speak to? They didn't want anyone to come to the table to speak to them or to represent them. That's a bad, I'm a diplomat as well. In diplomacy, you must speak, okay? So you must have...
Yeah, but the problem is that a lot of those kids don't have the opportunity to be diplomats. I mean, you are a diplomat. You are the vice president of a major international agricultural firm. I mean, you're the chairman of the big sort of chambers of commerce across Nigeria. They don't have those opportunities. And it is those opportunities that they want. Now, let's focus, though, on an area that you know quite a bit about in terms of the damage wrought on businesses in this country by those weeks of protest. What's your assessment of that?
My assessment across board, looking at not only Lagos, even though Lagos bore the brunt of it, I will say, conservatively put, we must have lost something in the neighborhood of close to $1 billion. And I'm saying this with all sense of responsibility. Because Lagos, for example, had total infrastructure breakdown to a point in which, I had a bird's eye view. I was what you call in French, témoin oculaire, eyewitness account. Because in my neighborhood in Lekki or in Axis, it was bedlam, total bedlam. And of course, again, we had all the COVID-19 relief, materials in warehouses everywhere. It was more or less like a Armageddon set on us. So I will put it at, in one of the chambers I belong to, which is still probably has done the assessment now. That's Lagos Chamber of Commerce as well. Put the figure around about that.
But do you see those protests, beyond the important point that you're making about the impact it had on business and the damage,
yes.
Do you see those protests as an important part of nation building in Nigeria? In other words, moving this country to the right path of rectitude after so many years of frustration for those young people? Or was it an equally destructive element in terms of the cost to businesses and the economy when you kind of weigh the two things up? The importance to nation building and the damage wrought on businesses and the economy.
On what I will call, Richter scales are usually used for earthquakes. But what happened to us was akin to a hurricane earthquake. So on that Richter scale, I will say you're not far from the truth. I think, if for those who are watching, I just wrote a piece which I entitled "Nigeria at the Crossroads."
I'm just seeing that piece actually.
We will not die in your war. What I was basically saying here is that the elites, when it's time for elections, fan embers of discord, bigotry, and all, and they make the whole nation volatile, situation volatile. And again, these same youth, who are very savvy, by the way, and who to a large extent were very well organized, save for that, that what I would call, how will I put it now?
When it suddenly degenerated
into, yes. If they had a proper consultant who would have told them, ceasefire. For now, I think they should organize themselves into parties, political parties, have political parties that can say, I don't want them to come with this, we are too young to run. Nobody is too young to run. President Macron is 42, or going on 43. The Chancellor of Austria is 34, going on 35, 36. The youth are taking over. Because of what? They are not pigeonholed into the ideas of old, of this is how we used to do it. This is how they are doing it the way they believe should be done. We must be progressive. And I think one key takeaway from this whole EndSARS thing is that, the youth took their destiny into their own hands. The only problem is that they overreached themselves, unfortunately.
But of course, there is. I'm just wondering if within NASIMA,
yes,
that you're sort of chairman
of the export group.
The export group. It's an association of chambers of commerce
yes,
and so on.
Yes.
That these kinds of protests end up depressing economic growth and are therefore bad for business.
Yeah.
Is that the general consensus? Or should the econometric approach be different in a situation like the EndSARS protest, given the unique circumstances of Nigeria?
I agree with you. I think that should be the way. That should be the way forward. And that's
the latter?
Yes, the latter,
right,
not the former. And that's why I say to people that, we must always engage as a collective. But we tend to do things more as individuals rather than as a collective. I think we have learned our lessons. But again, we must be very careful for history not to repeat itself. Lessons have been learned. We must try and do things in a different way and hopefully get the right result.
Right. But as you look back now, a year on,
yes,
is a way of assessing the financial implications of those protests to measure it against how successful its ambitions were. In other words, because despite the protests, many would argue that the police are still doing what they always did. and that there haven't been any significant reforms to the system.
I will not say so. You have to understand something. The reforms are put in place progressively. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. A problem that has been caused by 30, 40 years of decay, of hopelessness, of despair, cannot be sorted out overnight. I agree that government could move faster. But I think what the youth should do right now is to say to themselves again, not say that because they're celebrating 1 year after. They should do what you call
a post-mortem. Right.
And tell government that, you know what, yes, you've made your mistake, we've made our mistakes. This is where we were prior to the protest. This is where we were post the protest. And this is where we want to be moving forward. So we should have a tripartite kind of meeting of like minds, the youth, the private sector, OPS, organized private sector, and of course, this EndSARS movement, as it were, to come and see whether we can offer ourselves, a panacea and get out of this cul-de-sac.
And you're speaking, obviously, not just as a Nigerian, but also as a businessman.
Yes,
I mean, you're looking at it from the business, because, I mean, the problem with social unrest as well, in terms of its economic impact, particularly in a developing country that's trying to develop its economy, is that it affects not just the direct sort of economic activity, but it affects things like the stock market, through sort of an indirect channel. And basically, unrest leads to rising fears of uncertainty, tends to deter investors. So there's a knock-on effect.
The knock-on effect is pure and simple. When you have things like that happening, there is a kind of, how will I put it? There's a kind of, you send the wrong signals. Everybody gets jittery. What you now have
and then they take their money out.
What you now have is people who are here to portfolio investors in the first place just say to themselves, it's time to run. And because we have a market, capital market, that is developed, but not too deep, we can still get away with a few things. But this must not repeat itself, otherwise we'll be on bended knee.
Okay, I want to thank you very much indeed for your assessments there. Ade Adefeko is Vice President of Olam International and Chairman of Nasima Export Trade Group. He's also Honorary Consul for Botswana in Lagos. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.